Welcome to today's episode, Healing Through Story, where consciousness shifts to receive wisdom through narrative. In the space between sleeping and waking, stories live not as mere entertainment, but as vessels carrying the medicine your soul requires tonight. Beyond the veil of ordinary awareness, transformation awaits. There exists a realm where healing happens through tale, where the characters we meet become mirrors reflecting our deepest truths. Tonight, we venture into this sacred dimension, where time bends and healing flows through the ancient art of storytelling. In the quantum field of possibility, your story begins, not your personal story, but the universal story that lives within you. The story of every human being who has ever struggled with the command to just move on, as if healing were as simple as changing channels on a television, as if trauma were a choice, as if letting go happened on someone else's timeline. Through the portal of imagination, truth reveals itself. In dimensions unseen, your journey toward wholeness unfolds, carried by a character who understands something profound. That moving on isn't about forgetting, abandoning, or bypassing what has been. It's about integration, about allowing what was to become part of what is, transformed through the alchemy of acceptance. In the sacred space of narrative, transformation becomes possible. Tonight, consciousness prepares to receive not just a story, but a transmission, frequencies of healing that speak directly to the part of you that has been carrying burdens others cannot see, pain others cannot understand, and wounds that refuse to heal according to anyone else's schedule. Your body already knows this truth. Your nervous system has been protecting you, holding memories in muscle and bone, keeping you alert to dangers that may no longer exist, but once threatened your very survival. This isn't weakness. This is wisdom. This is the body's profound intelligence, honoring what was while gradually, gently, preparing for what might be. As we begin this journey together, allow yourself to settle into whatever position feels most nurturing. Whether you're lying down, sitting, or resting in any way that serves you, know that this space is yours. This time is yours. This healing is yours. The story that unfolds tonight carries frequencies of understanding, wavelengths of compassion, and vibrations of deep cellular acceptance. It speaks to the part of you that has been trying so hard to be over it, to be healed, to be moved on. It honors the complexity of human experience, the reality that some wounds become wisdom, some pain becomes purpose, and some healing happens not through forgetting, but through integration. In a small coastal town where fog rolls in like clockwork each evening, lived a woman named Elena. She was known throughout the community as the keeper of the Lighthouse Museum, a place where maritime history lived in carefully preserved artifacts and detailed stories of storms weathered and ships guided safely home. Elena possessed a rare gift. She could sense the emotional weight carried by objects. When visitors brought her family heirlooms, photographs, or letters from their ancestors, she felt their stories pressing against her awareness like whispers on the wind. This sensitivity had made her exceptional at her work, helping families understand their heritage. But it had also made her acutely aware of the pain people carried, sometimes for generations. At 42, Elena had built a life that felt both purposeful and protected. Her small apartment above the museum was filled with books, plants, and carefully curated objects that held only gentle memories. She had learned to create boundaries around her gift, to limit her exposure to the heaviest emotional residues that some artifacts carried. But Elena carried her own weight, a constellation of experiences that well-meaning people had repeatedly told her to get over. The sudden loss of her younger brother in a car accident 7 years ago. The dissolution of her marriage when grief made her husband uncomfortable. The estrangement from her parents, who believed that dwelling on tragedy was a choice, that healing should happen on a predictable timeline. You can't just stay stuck there forever, her mother had said during their last conversation. At some point, you have to move on. The words echoed in Elena's mind as she went about her daily routines, caring for the museum's collection, guiding visitors through exhibits, and maintaining the lighthouse's historical integrity. She had tried to move on. She had tried therapy, meditation, travel, new relationships, different jobs, creative pursuits. She had tried forcing herself to feel differently, to think differently, to be different. But something in her resisted the idea that healing meant forgetting. That wholeness required abandoning the tender places where love and loss intersected. Her brother's death had changed her, not just broken her, but transformed her. The grief had opened doorways to empathy she hadn't known existed. The loss had taught her about the preciousness of moments, the fragility of connection, the importance of presence. Yet everyone around her seemed to believe that growth meant returning to who she had been before. That healing looked like happiness. That moving on meant moving away from the experiences that had shaped her most profoundly. Elena's struggle manifested in countless small ways. She found herself apologizing for mentioning her brother, for having difficult days, for not being over it yet. She began to hide her feelings, to perform okayness, to pretend that her sensitivity was weakness rather than wisdom. She started believing that her inability to just move on was a personal failing rather than evidence of her depth, her loyalty, her capacity for love. The museum became both sanctuary and prison. Among the artifacts of others' lives, she felt understood. These objects held stories of loss, survival, transformation. They didn't judge her for carrying the past into the present. They demonstrated that memory and meaning were intertwined, that some experiences were meant to be integrated rather than abandoned. But in her daily interactions, Elena felt increasingly isolated. She watched others seemingly bounce back from difficulties, apparently able to compartmentalize pain and proceed with their lives. She wondered if there was something wrong with her, some defect in her emotional processing that made her unable to comply with the universal directive to move on. The Lighthouse Museum sat on a rocky outcropping that jutted into the Pacific Ocean, connected to the mainland by a narrow strip of land that disappeared during the highest tides. This geographic isolation perfectly mirrored Elena's emotional landscape, connected to the world, but somehow separate, accessible, but requiring intention and timing to reach. The museum itself was a testament to endurance. Built in 1847, it had weathered countless storms, guided thousands of ships to safety, and stood witness to the full spectrum of human experience. Its walls held stories of rescue and loss, of sailors returning home and ships that never made it to port. The building understood that some experiences left permanent marks. That survival often meant carrying scars as badges of strength rather than shame. Elena's living quarters occupied the top floor, with windows facing in all directions. From her bedroom, she could see the town spreading inland, with its neat rows of houses, bustling harbor, and the highway that connected this place to the larger world. From her kitchen, she looked out over the endless expanse of ocean, where the horizon blurred the line between water and sky, between what was and what might be. The museum's collection reflected the complexity of maritime life. There were objects of beauty-polished brass instruments, intricate scrimshaw, photographs of magnificent vessels under full sail. But there were also reminders of danger pieces of shipwrecks, emergency flares, life preservers that had saved lives and others that couldn't. The collection didn't shy away from the reality that the sea was both life-giver and life-taker. That beauty and danger often occupied the same space. Elena had arranged the exhibits to tell complete stories, not just triumphant ones. She included displays about the psychological challenges faced by lighthouse keepers, the families who waited for ships that never returned, the communities that formed around both celebration and mourning. Visitors often commented on how the museum felt different from others, more honest, more complete, more willing to hold complexity without offering simple solutions. The lighthouse itself still functioned, though modern GPS had reduced its practical necessity. Every evening, Elena climbed the spiral stairs to the lamp room and activated the beacon. The light swept across the water in its ancient pattern, a rhythm that had remained constant for over a century. She found deep comfort in this ritual, in being part of something larger than herself, in maintaining a tradition that honored both the past and the future. The town below had its own relationship with memory and loss. Many of the families had lived there for generations, their histories intertwined with the sea's gifts and demands. They understood that some experiences became part of the landscape, that certain losses were woven into the fabric of community. Identity. The annual memorial service for those lost at sea drew hundreds of people, not just to remember the dead, but to acknowledge that grief was a form of love, that memory was a form of presence. But even in this community that theoretically understood loss, Elena felt the pressure to conform to timelines that felt arbitrary and imposed. There was an unspoken expectation that grief should be processed within a certain period, that healing should look a certain way, that moving on meant moving away from the experiences that had shaped her most profoundly. The natural environment around the lighthouse operated on different principles. The tide pools revealed ecosystems that had adapted to constant change while maintaining their essential character. The rocks bore the marks of centuries of waves, scarred but not broken, shaped by their encounters with force and time. The cliff faces showed geological layers that told stories stretching back millions of years, each stratum a record of transformation that honored what came before while building toward what would come next. Elena found herself drawn to these natural teachers, these examples of resilience that didn't require forgetting or abandoning the past. The tide pools didn't get over the daily assault of waves. They incorporated the rhythm, used the disturbance to bring fresh nutrients, created beauty from the constant negotiation between stability and change. Elena's days followed patterns that had crystallized over the 7 years since her brother's death. Each morning, she woke before dawn, drawn to the lighthouse's lamp room to witness the beam's final rotations before daybreak. This ritual had begun during those first raw months of grief, when sleep felt impossible and the lighthouse's steady presence offered the only comfort. She could find Dot as she stood in the lamp room, watching the light sweep across the water. Elena often found herself having conversations with Marcus, her brother. Not the desperate, bargaining conversations of early grief, but gentle exchanges about the day ahead, about visitors she'd met, about the small discoveries that made her work meaningful. These conversations felt natural, necessary, part of how she stayed connected to the love that death couldn't diminish. But she had learned to keep these conversations private. The few times she had mentioned them, to her therapist, to a friend, to her mother, she had encountered concern, suggestions that she might be stuck, that healthy grieving meant letting go of such connections. The message was clear. Moving on meant moving away from relationship with the deceased, even when that relationship brought comfort rather than pain. Elena's morning routine extended to preparing breakfast while listening to the local radio station's weather report. She had discovered that she could predict the emotional tone of her day based on the weather patterns, not because external conditions controlled her mood, but because she had learned to attune herself to the subtle energies that preceded storms, the pressure changes that signaled shifting atmospheric conditions. This sensitivity had become heightened since Marcus's death, as if grief had opened channels of perception that remained accessible throughout the morning. As she prepared the museum for visitors, Elena found herself unconsciously assessing each person's emotional state. Her gift for sensing the stories held in objects had evolved into a broader sensitivity to the pain and healing that people carried. She could feel the weight of unprocessed grief in a visitor's shoulders, the likeness of someone who had found peace with their losses, the tension of someone forcing themselves to move on before they were ready. This sensitivity created a complex relationship with her work. On one hand, it made her exceptional at helping people connect with their family histories, at creating space for the full spectrum of human experience. On the other hand, it meant she was constantly exposed to evidence that she wasn't alone in her struggle with the pressure to heal according to others. Timelines. Elena had developed subtle strategies for managing this sensitivity. She wore her grandmother's silver bracelet, which seemed to provide some energetic protection. She took breaks every 2 hours to walk the perimeter of the lighthouse, grounding herself in the physical sensations of wind and salt air. She had learned to recognize the signs of emotional overwhelm, the tightness in her chest, the buzzing in her ears, the feeling of being pulled underwater, and respond with gentleness rather than judgment. But these very strategies became evidence, in others' eyes, of her inability to just move on. Her need for boundaries was interpreted as avoidance. Her sensitivity was seen as weakness. Her continued connection to her brother's memory was viewed as unhealthy attachment. The coping mechanisms that allowed her to function in the world were reframed as symptoms of incomplete healing. The afternoons brought different challenges. When the museum was busy, Elena found herself performing a version of herself that others found more comfortable, lighter, more resilient, less affected by the weight of memory and loss. She had learned to deflect personal questions, to redirect conversations about her brother toward more general discussions about the museum's collection, to present herself as someone who had worked through her grief rather than someone who was learning to live with it. This performance required tremendous energy. By evening, Elena often felt depleted, not from the work itself, but from the constant vigilance required to appear healed enough for others' comfort. She had begun to understand that her struggle wasn't just with grief. It was with a culture that demanded certain expressions of grief, certain timelines for healing, certain ways of moving forward that felt disconnected from her actual experience. The evenings brought both relief and loneliness. In the privacy of her apartment, Elena could remove the mask of being over it. She could look at photographs of Marcus without apologizing for the tears that came. She could speak his name without watching others' faces for signs of discomfort. She could acknowledge the ongoing reality of grief without being offered solutions, suggestions, or timelines for feeling differently. But this freedom came with its own weight. The more Elena honored her authentic experience of loss and healing, the more isolated she felt from a world that seemed to believe that growth meant forgetting, that strength meant independence from the past, that moving on meant moving away from the experiences that had shaped her most profoundly. The pattern of forcing herself to move on hadn't begun with Marcus's death. Elena could trace its origins back to her childhood, to a family system that prized resilience, independence, and emotional self-sufficiency above all else. Her parents, both successful professionals, had created a household where feelings were viewed as temporary inconveniences to be managed efficiently rather than meaningful experiences to be explored. When Elena was 8 years old, her beloved grandmother died unexpectedly. Elena had spent every summer at her grandmother's house, learning to tend the garden, listening to family stories, feeling deeply seen and cherished in ways that were rare in her efficient, goal-oriented household. Her grandmother's death was her first encounter with profound loss, and she responded with the full force of childhood grief tears, tantrums, refusal to eat, desperate pleas for her grandmother to come back. Her parents, uncomfortable with such raw emotion, had responded with a combination of logic and impatience. "She's gone, Elena. Crying won't bring her back. You need to be strong." When Elena continued to grieve openly, they sought professional help, not to support her grieving process, but to fix her inability to bounce back. The therapist, influenced by the family's goals and the therapeutic approaches of the time, focused on helping Elena process her grief so she could move on. The sessions were structured around helping her say goodbye, helping her understand that her grandmother would want her to be happy, helping her redirect her energy toward present moment activities rather than past-focused mourning. Elena had learned to comply. She learned to keep her conversations with her grandmother private, to express only socially acceptable amounts of sadness, to demonstrate that she was healing by resuming normal activities and emotional expressions. She learned that the love for someone who had died was supposed to transform into gratitude for the time they had shared. That ongoing grief was a form of selfishness. That healthy people moved forward rather than backward. This early training had served her well in many ways. She had developed resilience, independence, and the ability to function effectively, even while carrying emotional pain. She had learned to be sensitive to others' comfort levels, to manage her own needs in ways that didn't burden others, to find private spaces for the parts of her experience that others found difficult to witness. But the pattern had also created a split in her psyche. There was the public Elena, who demonstrated appropriate levels of healing and growth, who showed up reliably for work and relationships, who appeared to process difficulties with admirable efficiency. And there was the private Elena, who continued to love and grieve and remember in ways that felt authentic but unacceptable. When Marcus died, this split became untenable. The grief was too large, too encompassing, too fundamental to her being to be managed in the ways she had learned. But the pressure to apply the familiar pattern was enormous. Family members, friends, therapists, even well-meaning strangers offered the same messages she had received as a child, that healing meant moving forward, that strength meant independence from the past, that love meant letting go. Elena had tried to comply. She had thrown herself into work, into new relationships, into travel and therapy and spiritual practices. She had tried to be grateful for the time she had shared with Marcus, rather than sad about the time they would never have. She had tried to celebrate his life, rather than mourn his death. She had tried to transform her grief into something more palatable, more useful, more evidence of her growth and healing. But her body had other plans. Her nervous system had been shaped by 26 years of relationship with Marcus. The nervous system had been shaped by 26 years of relationship with Marcus. Safety and joy and deep connection they had shared. It couldn't simply forget, couldn't simply redirect its patterns of love and attachment, couldn't simply move on from the most significant loss she had ever experienced. The more Elena tried to force herself to heal according to others' timelines, the more fragmented she became. Part of her energy went toward genuine grief and healing, but an increasing amount went toward managing others' discomfort with her grief, toward performing recovery she didn't feel, toward apologizing for the reality of her experience. She began to understand that the problem wasn't her inability to move on. It was the assumption that moving on meant abandoning, that healing meant forgetting, that growth meant independence from the experiences that had shaped her most profoundly. The pattern that had been adaptive in childhood, that had helped her survive in a family system uncomfortable with depth of feeling, had become a prison that prevented her from accessing the full spectrum of her healing capacity. The original protective intention was clear. Keep the family comfortable, maintain relationships, ensure survival in a system that couldn't hold complexity. But the pattern had outlived its usefulness. Elena was no longer a child dependent on others' approval for survival. She was an adult capable of creating her own definitions of healing, her own timeline for transformation, her own ways of honoring both love and loss. The collision between Elena's authentic experience and the world's expectations had reached a crisis point. It manifested most clearly in her relationship with David, a kind and patient man she had been seeing for 6 months. David represented everything that should have been right for her stability, affection, genuine care for her, well-being. But his increasing discomfort with her continued grief had begun to mirror every other relationship in her life. "I want to help you heal," David had said during their last serious conversation. "But I don't know how to do that if you won't let go of the past. It's like you're married to your grief." His words had struck Elena like a physical blow, not because they were malicious, but because they revealed the fundamental misunderstanding that shaped every interaction about her healing process. David, like everyone else, believed that healing meant severing connection, that moving on meant moving away, that love for the living required abandoning love for the dead. Elena had tried to explain. She had talked about integration rather than abandonment, about the difference between being stuck in grief and being changed by it, about the possibility that some losses were meant to be carried rather than overcome. But her words seemed to fall into a void of incomprehension. David heard only evidence of her unwillingness to heal, her resistance to happiness, her choice to remain stuck in the past. The pressure had begun to affect every aspect of Elena's life. At work, she found herself increasingly careful about how she presented herself, worried that her continued sensitivity to loss might be perceived as professional weakness. She had begun to minimize her gifts, to downplay the depth of her empathy, to present herself as more bounced back than she actually felt. Her relationship with her parents had become even more strained. During their monthly phone calls, Elena found herself editing her experiences, reporting only the positive developments, avoiding any mention of the ongoing reality of grief. Her mother's relief at these reports felt like both a victory and a betrayal. A victory because it maintained the relationship, a betrayal because it required abandoning her authentic experience. But Elena was beginning to recognize the cost of this pattern. The energy required to maintain the performance of being over it was becoming unsustainable. She was exhausted from managing others' comfort levels, from apologizing for her depth, from pretending that healing was a destination rather than a process. She was tired of being told that her capacity for love was a weakness, that her sensitivity was a flaw, that her inability to just move on was a personal failing. More importantly, Elena was beginning to question the assumption that had shaped her entire approach to healing. What if moving on didn't mean moving away? What if healing wasn't about forgetting, but about integration? What if the goal wasn't to return to who she had been before Marcus's death, but to become who she was meant to be because of it? These questions had begun to surface during her evening walks around the lighthouse. As she watched the beam sweep across the water, Elena found herself wondering about the lighthouse's own relationship with time and change. The structure had weathered countless storms, but it hadn't moved on from them. It had been shaped by them, strengthened by them, made more beautiful by the patina of salt and wind and time. The lighthouse didn't apologize for bearing the marks of its encounters with the elements. It didn't try to return to its original state after each storm. Instead, it incorporated each experience into its ongoing identity, becoming more itself rather than less, more stable rather than more fragile, more capable of serving its purpose. Rather than less, Elena began to wonder if human healing might operate on similar principles. What if the goal wasn't to return to some previous state of innocence or happiness, but to become more fully herself, more deeply capable of love and service and connection? What if her sensitivity to others' pain wasn't a symptom of incomplete healing, but evidence of expanded capacity? What if her ongoing relationship with Marcus wasn't pathology, but a demonstration of love's persistence beyond physical death? These questions represented a fundamental challenge to everything Elena had been taught about healing and growth. They suggested that the problem wasn't her inability to move on, but the culture's narrow definition of what moving on meant. They implied that her resistance to abandoning her grief might be wisdom rather than weakness, that her continued love for Marcus might be strength rather than dysfunction. The collision had reached the point where Elena could no longer maintain the split between her authentic experience and others' expectations. She was beginning to understand that true healing might require not just integration of her grief, but integration of her resistance to others' timelines, her refusal to abandon love for the sake of others' comfort, her insistence on honoring the full complexity of her experience. For the first time in 7 years, Elena was ready to stop trying to heal according to others' definitions and start exploring what healing might look like if she honored her own wisdom, her own timeline, her own understanding of love's persistence. The catalyst arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, disguised as an elderly woman with a weathered leather satchel and eyes that held the depth of someone who had lived through considerable loss. She introduced herself as Miriam, explaining that she had driven from 3 states away to visit the Lighthouse Museum because she had heard about Elena's gift for helping people understand their family histories. From the satchel, Miriam withdrew a collection of items that immediately caught Elena's attention, not just because of their obvious age and careful preservation, but because of the emotional weight they carried. There was a ship's compass that had belonged to Miriam's grandfather, a lighthouse keeper's journal from the 1890s, and a photograph of a young woman standing beside a lighthouse that looked remarkably similar to Elena's own. My great-grandmother was a lighthouse keeper's wife, Miriam explained, her voice carrying the cadence of someone who had told this story many times. She lost 3 children to scarlet fever in a single winter. The townspeople kept telling her she needed to move on, that dwelling on the deaths was unhealthy, that she was choosing to stay stuck in grief. Elena felt a familiar tightening in her chest, recognition of a story that echoed her own experience. She reached for the photograph and immediately felt the emotional imprint of the woman in the image, not just sadness, but a kind of fierce loyalty to her love for the children she had lost. But she didn't move on, Miriam continued, watching Elena's face carefully. Instead, she began keeping detailed records of every ship that passed the lighthouse. She wrote down the names of vessels, the conditions they encountered, the families they carried. She started corresponding with other lighthouse keepers up and down the coast, sharing information about weather patterns, dangerous currents, safe harbors. Elena looked up from the photograph, sensing that this story was building towards something important. What happened to her? She created the first informal network of lighthouse keepers along this stretch of coast. Her record-keeping helped prevent dozens of shipwrecks. Her correspondence became the foundation for what eventually became the Coast Guard's communication system in this region. She saved hundreds of lives. Miriam paused, her eyes holding Elena steadily, not by moving on from her grief, but by transforming it into service. The words hit Elena like a wave, carrying implications that shifted something fundamental in her understanding. She had been so focused on trying to heal according to others' definitions that she had never considered the possibility that her sensitivity, her ongoing grief, her resistance to moving on, might actually be sources of strength rather than symptoms of weakness. She wrote about it, Miriam continued, opening the journal to a page marked with a faded ribbon. She said that people kept telling her that dwelling on death was morbid, that she needed to focus on life. But she realized that her intimate knowledge of loss was exactly what made her capable of preventing other losses. Her grief had taught her to pay attention to details that others missed, to take seriously the signs of danger that others dismissed. Elena read the passage Miriam indicated, written in careful script that spoke of a woman who had found a way to honor her pain while serving others. They say I am too concerned with death, that I should think of happier things. But I have learned that those who have walked closely with death become skilled at recognizing life's fragility. I watch the horizon not from morbid fascination, but from profound appreciation for the preciousness of every soul that crosses these waters. My children's deaths taught me that every moment matters, that prevention is a form of love, that vigilance is a form of prayer. I brought these things to you, Miriam said, settling into the chair across from Elena's desk, because I've been watching the lighthouse keeper tradition, and I've noticed something interesting. The most effective keepers weren't the ones who had never experienced loss. They were the ones who had learned to transform their personal encounters with loss into heightened awareness of others' vulnerability. Elena felt something shifting in her chest, a loosening of tension she had carried for so long she had forgotten it was there. Are you saying that my grief might actually be useful? I'm saying that your grief has already transformed you in ways that others can't see. Your sensitivity to others' pain, your ability to create space for the full spectrum of human experience, your instinct to preserve stories that others might forget. These aren't symptoms of incomplete healing. They're evidence of how loss has expanded your capacity for love and service. The conversation continued for 2 hours, ranging across topics that Elena had never been able to discuss with anyone. The ongoing relationship with deceased loved ones, the wisdom that comes from intimate knowledge of loss, the way that some experiences are meant to be integrated rather than overcome. Miriam spoke with the authority of someone who had traveled a similar path, who had learned to honor grief as a teacher rather than an enemy. The problem, Miriam explained, isn't that you can't move on. The problem is that the culture has forgotten that some experiences are meant to change us permanently, that some losses are meant to be carried as sources of wisdom rather than burdens to be shed. Your brother's death initiated you into a deeper understanding of love's persistence. Trying to move on from that understanding is like trying to forget how to read. Elena found herself crying, not the desperate tears of early grief, but tears of recognition and relief. For the first time in 7 years, someone was suggesting that her inability to just move on wasn't a personal failing, but evidence of her depth, her loyalty, her expanded capacity for love. So what do I do? Elena asked. How do I live in a world that keeps telling me to let go when letting go feels like betrayal? Miriam smiled, an expression that held both sadness and wisdom. You learn to distinguish between carrying grief and being carried by it. You learn to transform your intimate knowledge of loss into service for others who are struggling with the same pressure to heal according to others' timelines. You learn to trust your own wisdom about what healing looks like, even when it doesn't match what others expect. She reached into her satchel and withdrew one final item, a small, carved wooden lighthouse that fit perfectly in Elena's palm. This belonged to my great-grandmother. She carved it herself during that first winter after her children died. She said it reminded her that some lights are meant to keep burning, even in the darkest conditions, especially in the darkest conditions. As Elena held the carved lighthouse, she felt a profound shift in her understanding. What if her ongoing grief wasn't evidence of being stuck, but evidence of love's persistence? What if her sensitivity to others' pain wasn't weakness, but a form of service? What if her resistance to moving on wasn't pathology, but wisdom? Your brother's death changed you, Miriam said, preparing to leave. Not damaged you, not broken you, but changed you. The question isn't how to get back to who you were before. It's how to become who you're meant to be because of what you've learned. After Miriam left, Elena sat in her office holding the carved lighthouse, feeling as though she had been given permission to honor her experience in ways she had never imagined possible. The pressure to heal according to others' timelines hadn't disappeared, but for the first time, she had a framework for understanding her resistance to that pressure as wisdom rather than weakness. The first experiment began that evening during Elena's ritual activation of the lighthouse beam. Instead of apologizing to Marcus for her continued grief, instead of trying to transform her sadness into something more palatable, Elena spoke to him directly about the conversation with Miriam. I think I've been trying to stop loving you," she said aloud, her voice carrying across the empty lamp room. I think I believed that healing meant cutting the connection, that moving on meant moving away from you. But what if that's not what healing means? The words felt dangerous, revolutionary. Elena had been taught that healthy grieving involved letting go. That continued connection with the deceased was a form of denial or pathology. But as she spoke to Marcus, she felt not the desperation of someone clinging to the past, but the natural flow of love that death hadn't diminished. "What if I'm not supposed to get over losing you?" she continued. "What if I'm supposed to learn how to carry the love differently, how to let it change me in ways that serve others?" The beam swept across the water in its eternal pattern, and Elena felt something she hadn't experienced in years: alignment between her authentic experience and her actions. She wasn't performing grief or managing others' comfort levels. She was simply being present with the love that persisted beyond physical death. Over the following weeks, Elena began to experiment with small acts of authenticity. When David expressed concern about her dwelling on the past, instead of apologizing or deflecting, she tried a different approach. "I understand that my continued grief makes you uncomfortable," she said. "But I'm learning that what you call dwelling on the past might actually be integrating wisdom from the past. My brother's death taught me things about love and loss that I can't unlearn. Trying to move on from that understanding feels like trying to forget how to read." David's response was predictable concern about her inability to let go. Suggestions for additional therapy: gentle but persistent pressure to choose happiness over grief. But Elena noticed something different in her own response. Instead of collapsing into self-doubt, instead of questioning her own experience, she felt a quiet certainty that her understanding was valid, even if it wasn't shared. "I'm not choosing grief over happiness," she explained. "I'm choosing integration over abandonment. I'm choosing to honor the full spectrum of my experience, rather than editing it to match others' comfort levels." The conversation didn't resolve their differences, but it marked a significant shift in Elena's relationship with external pressure. She was beginning to understand that the problem wasn't her inability to heal according to others' timelines. It was others' inability to recognize authentic healing when it didn't match their expectations. At work, Elena began to experiment with bringing more of her authentic self into her interactions with visitors. When someone shared a story about their own losses, instead of offering the conventional wisdom about moving on, she began to explore different possibilities. Some experiences change us so profoundly that trying to return to who we were before feels impossible. She found herself saying to a woman who had lost her husband 2 years earlier, "Maybe the goal isn't to get back to your old self, but to discover who you're becoming because of what you've learned." The woman's response was immediate and profound. "Everyone keeps telling me I need to start dating again, to get back out there, to focus on the future. But I'm not the same person I was before he died. I don't want to pretend otherwise." Elena felt the familiar recognition of shared experience, but now she had a different framework for understanding it. What if that's not a problem to be solved, but wisdom to be honored? What if your transformation is evidence of how deeply you loved? How profoundly you've been changed by that love? These conversations began to multiply. Elena discovered that her willingness to honor the complexity of loss, to resist the pressure to move on, created space for others to explore their own authentic experiences of grief and healing. People began to seek her out, not just for help with family histories, but for understanding how to navigate the gap between their inner experience and outer expectations. Elena started to recognize patterns in these conversations. So many people carried shame about their inability to heal according to prescribed timelines. So many felt isolated in their ongoing relationships with deceased loved ones. So many had been told that their depth of feeling was weakness rather than strength. I still talk to my son, confided a man whose child had died in military service. It's been 5 years, and everyone thinks I should be past this. But the conversations bring me peace. They help me feel connected to the best parts of who I am. Elena no longer felt compelled to offer solutions or timelines. Instead, she found herself asking different questions. What do those conversations give you that nothing else does? What would happen if you trusted that connection rather than questioning it? What if your ongoing relationship with your son is evidence of love's persistence rather than evidence of incomplete healing? The experimental phase revealed something profound about Elena's gifts. Her sensitivity to emotional pain, which she had been taught to see as excessive or problematic, was actually a rare capacity for recognizing and honoring the full spectrum of human experience. Her resistance to moving on wasn't pathology, it was wisdom about the difference between integration and abandonment. But the experiments also revealed the cost of authenticity in a culture uncomfortable with complexity. David ultimately ended their relationship, unable to accept Elena's refusal to heal according to his timeline. Her parents became increasingly concerned about what they perceived as her inability to get over Marcus's death. Some colleagues at the museum began to express worry about her dwelling on grief. Elena found herself at a crossroads. She could return to the familiar pattern of managing others' comfort levels, of performing recovery she didn't feel, of apologizing for the depth of her experience. Or she could continue experimenting with authenticity, even if it meant greater isolation from those who couldn't understand her path. The choice became clear during a particularly difficult conversation with her mother. "I'm worried you're becoming one of those people who defines herself by her tragedy," her mother said during their monthly call. "You're more than your grief, Elena. You're choosing to stay stuck." For the first time in her adult life, Elena responded with complete honesty. "I'm not stuck, Mom. I'm transformed. Marcus's death changed me in ways that I can't undo and wouldn't want to. I'm not choosing grief over life. I'm choosing integration over abandonment. I'm choosing to honor the full spectrum of my experience, rather than editing it to make others comfortable." The silence that followed was heavy with disappointment and disapproval. But Elena felt something she hadn't experienced in years: complete alignment between her inner truth and her outer expression. She was no longer splitting her energy between authentic experience and performance of recovery. "I understand this. It's difficult for you to accept," Elena continued. "But I'm learning that healing doesn't mean returning to who I was before. It means becoming who I'm meant to be because of what I've learned. My sensitivity to loss has made me more capable of helping others. My ongoing relationship with Marcus has taught me about love's persistence. My resistance to moving on has shown me the difference between integration and abandonment." The breakthrough came on a stormy November evening when Elena was called to help with an emergency situation. A fishing vessel had radioed for assistance, reporting engine failure in increasingly dangerous conditions. While the Coast Guard was en route, Elena's lighthouse was serving as the primary navigation beacon for the struggling boat. As Elena climbed to the lamproom to ensure the beacon was operating at maximum intensity, she felt the familiar presence of Marcus beside her. But tonight, instead of the gentle conversations that had characterized their ongoing relationship, she felt him urging her toward a different kind of awareness. "Pay attention," she heard him say, not in words, but in the kind of direct knowing that had always characterized their deepest communications. "This is why you couldn't move on. This is what your grief was preparing you for." Standing in the lamproom, monitoring the radio communications between the Coast Guard and the struggling vessel, Elena suddenly understood the profound difference between being stuck in grief and being transformed by it. Her years of intimate knowledge of loss had heightened her awareness of life's fragility her appreciation for the preciousness of every moment, her understanding of what was truly at stake when people were in danger. The fishing vessel's captain was reporting that the storm was worsening, that they were taking on water, that they weren't sure they could maintain course toward the lighthouse. Elena found herself able to hear not just the technical details of their situation, but the emotional undercurrents, the fear in the captain's voice, the desperation of the crew, the weight of responsibility for the lives under his care. "I can help guide them," Elena radioed to the Coast Guard. "I know these waters. I know where the currents are strongest, where the rocks are hidden, where they can find safer passage." For the next 3 hours, Elena served as communication link between the Coast Guard and the fishing vessel, using her intimate knowledge of the local waters to help guide the boat to safety. But her assistance went deeper than technical navigation. Her voice carried a quality of calm presence that seemed to steady the frightened crew, a depth of understanding that came from her own intimate knowledge of loss and survival. "You're gonna make it," she told the captain during a particularly frightening moment when the engine failed completely. "The Coast Guard is almost to your position. I can see their lights from here. You're not alone in this." When the fishing vessel was finally brought to safety, Elena remained in the lamp room, overwhelmed by the clarity of understanding that had emerged during the crisis. Her grief hadn't been something to overcome. It had been preparation for service. Her sensitivity to loss hadn't been weakness. It had been training for recognizing when others were in danger. Her ongoing relationship with Marcus hadn't been pathology. It had been access to a kind of love and wisdom that transcended physical death. She understood now why she had never been able to just move on. Moving on would have meant abandoning the very capacities that had allowed her to serve others tonight. It would have meant cutting herself off from the depth of awareness that came from intimate knowledge of loss. It would have meant returning to a more superficial understanding of life's preciousness. "Thank you," she whispered to Marcus, feeling his presence as clearly as she felt the wind and salt air. "Thank you for not letting me abandon what we learned together." The breakthrough wasn't just intellectual understanding, it was a fundamental shift in Elena's relationship with her own experience. For 7 years, she had been trying to heal by moving away from her grief, by returning to who she had been before Marcus's death. But tonight she understood that healing meant moving through the grief, allowing it to transform her into someone capable of deeper service, greater compassion, more profound love. The days following the rescue brought unexpected validation for Elena's new understanding. The fishing vessel's captain made a special trip to the lighthouse to thank her personally, bringing with him a story that would change Elena's life once again. "My father was lost at sea 30 years ago," he told her, sitting in the museum's main room surrounded by artifacts of maritime survival and loss. "I became a fisherman partly to understand what he experienced, partly to feel close to him. Everyone told me I was being morbid, that I needed to move on, choose a different profession. But being on the water makes me feel connected to him in ways that nothing else does." Elena felt the familiar recognition of shared experience, but now she had a framework for understanding it that honored rather than pathologized the connection. "Last night, when the engine failed and we were taking on water, I felt him with me," the captain continued. "Not as hallucination or wishful thinking, but as real presence. His knowledge of these waters, his understanding of survival, his love it, was all available to me when I needed it most." Your voice on the radio carried that same quality. You weren't just giving technical information. You were giving love, presence, the kind of wisdom that comes from knowing loss intimately. The captain paused, looking around at the museum's collection of maritime artifacts. "People keep telling me that talking to my father is unhealthy, that I need to let go. But last night proved to me that some connections aren't meant to be severed. Some relationships continue beyond physical death. Some love becomes a source of strength rather than a burden to be carried. Elena found herself crying, not tears of sadness, but tears of recognition and relief. Here was someone else who understood that the goal wasn't to move on from love, but to allow love to transform them in ways that served life itself. "What changed for you tonight?" the captain asked, clearly sensing that Elena had experienced her own breakthrough. "I stopped trying to heal by moving away from my grief," Elena replied. "I started understanding that my grief had been preparing me for deeper service. My brother's death didn't break me. It initiated me into a different way of loving, a different way of being present with life's fragility and preciousness." The conversation continued for hours, ranging across topics that Elena had never been able to discuss openly. The ongoing reality of love beyond death, the wisdom that emerges from intimate knowledge of loss, the way that some experiences are meant to change us permanently rather than temporarily. "So what happens now?" the captain asked as he prepared to leave. "How do you live with this understanding in a world that doesn't recognize it?" Elena looked around the lighthouse museum, seeing it with new eyes. This wasn't just a repository of maritime history. It was a sanctuary for understanding the full spectrum of human experience with loss and survival. The artifacts didn't tell stories of moving on from danger and difficulty. They told stories of transformation, of wisdom gained through encounter with life's most challenging experiences. "I think I stop apologizing for who I've become," Elena said. "I think I start trusting that my understanding of healing is valid, even when it doesn't match others' expectations. I think I learned to distinguish between carrying grief and being carried by it, between honoring the past and being trapped by it." She felt Marcus's presence again, not as desperate clinging to what was lost, but his ongoing connection to what love had taught them both about the preciousness of life, the importance of presence, the persistence of connection beyond physical form. For the first time in 7 years, Elena felt no need to apologize for her inability to just move on. She understood now that moving on had never been the goal. Integration had been the goal. Transformation had been the goal. Learning to carry love in new forms had been the goal. The months following Elena's breakthrough brought gradual but profound changes in how she structured her life and work. She began to understand that creating a new reality meant not just changing her understanding of grief, but reorganizing her entire existence around her expanded capacity for depth and service. The first change involved her approach to the Lighthouse Museum. Instead of presenting maritime history as a series of triumphs over adversity, Elena began to create exhibits that honored the full spectrum of human experience with loss and survival. She developed a new wing dedicated to transformed by the swerve. Sea stories of people whose encounters with maritime loss had deepened their capacity for wisdom, service, and love. The exhibit included Miriam's great-grandmother's story, alongside others Elena had discovered through research and personal connections. There was the lighthouse keeper who lost his son in a shipwreck and went on to develop new safety protocols that saved hundreds of lives. The Coast Guard officer whose brother drowned and who dedicated her career to water rescue, becoming one of the most skilled helicopter pilots in the service. The marine biologist whose father was lost at sea and whose research into ocean currents led to breakthroughs in navigation safety. These aren't stories of people who moved on from their losses, Elena explained to visitors as she guided them through the new exhibit. These are stories of people who allowed their losses to transform them, who discovered that intimate knowledge of tragedy can become intimate knowledge of how to prevent tragedy for others. The response from visitors was immediate and profound. People began sharing their own stories of transformation through loss, their own struggles with the pressure to just move on. The museum became not just a repository of maritime history, but a sanctuary for understanding the complexity of human healing. Elena's daily routines. also shifted to reflect her new understanding. Her morning conversations with Marcus evolved from desperate attempts at connection to natural exchanges about the day ahead, about challenges she was facing, about the wisdom she was discovering. She no longer felt the need to hide these conversations or apologize for them. They had become part of her spiritual practice, a way of accessing love and guidance that transcended physical form. Her evening ritual of activating the lighthouse beam took on new meaning. As she climbed the spiral stairs to the lamp room, Elena carried with her the stories of everyone who had visited the museum that day, everyone who had shared their struggles with healing according to others' timelines. The lighthouse beam became a symbol not just of navigation safety, but of the persistent light that love creates even in the darkest circumstances. Elena's relationship with her own sensitivity also transformed. Instead of trying to protect herself from the emotional weight of others' stories, she learned to create healthy boundaries while remaining open to the wisdom that came through her gift. She developed practices for grounding herself after difficult conversations, rituals for clearing emotional residue that didn't belong to her, ways of distinguishing between empathy and absorption. My sensitivity isn't something to be managed or overcome, she wrote in her journal. It's a tool for service, a capacity for recognizing where healing is needed most urgently. The goal isn't to become less sensitive, but to become more skillful in how I use this sensitivity. Her social relationships required the most significant reconstruction. Elena made the difficult decision to limit contact with people who continued to pressure her to heal according to their timelines. This meant reducing conversations with her parents, ending relationships with friends who couldn't accept her transformation, creating boundaries around discussions of her grief and healing process. But the space created by these difficult boundaries allowed for new relationships to emerge. Elena began connecting with others who understood that some experiences are meant to change us permanently, that some wisdom comes only through intimate knowledge of loss, that some healing happens through integration rather than abandonment. She started a monthly gathering at the Lighthouse Museum for people navigating their own resistance to moving on. The group wasn't therapy, it was community, a space where people could share their authentic experiences without pressure to heal, according to prescribed timelines. We're not here to fix each other, Elena explained during the first gathering. We're here to witness each other's truth, to honor the complexity of human healing, to support each other in trusting our own wisdom about what transformation looks like. The gatherings grew organically, drawing people from throughout the region who had been feeling isolated in their struggles with grief, loss, and the pressure to heal according to others' expectations. Elena found herself serving not as a professional facilitator, but as someone who had learned to honor her own healing process and could create space for others to do the same. Her work life expanded beyond the museum. Elena began consulting with other institutions, hospitals, hospices, grief counseling centers about how to create space for the full spectrum of healing experiences. She spoke at conferences about the difference between being stuck in grief and being transformed by it, about the wisdom that emerges from refusing to just move on. The goal isn't to help people get over their losses, she told a gathering of grief counselors. The goal is to help people discover who they're becoming because of their losses, to honor the transformation that grief can create when it's allowed to unfold, according to its own wisdom rather than forced to conform to external timelines. Elena's financial situation also stabilized in unexpected ways. The new exhibit drew visitors from far beyond the local area, people seeking understanding of their own complex relationships with loss and healing. Elena began offering individual consultations, not as therapy, but as guidance for people learning to trust their own healing wisdom. I help people understand that their resistance to moving on might actually be wisdom, she explained to a journalist writing about her work. I help them distinguish between carrying grief and being carried by it, between honoring the past and being trapped by it. I helped them discover that their sensitivity to loss might be preparation for deeper service. The most profound change was in Elena's relationship with time itself. She stopped measuring her healing according to external markers, anniversaries of Marcus's death, milestones she should have reached, comparisons to how others had processed similar losses. Instead, she learned to trust the organic unfolding of her transformation, to honor the seasons of grief and growth, to understand that some wisdom takes years to ripen. Healing doesn't happen on anyone else's schedule, she reflected during one of her evening walks around the lighthouse. It happens according to its own mysterious timeline, like the tide, like the seasons, like the slow work of waves shaping stone into something beautiful and strong. As Elena integrated her new understanding of healing, she discovered that wisdom embodiment required not just intellectual knowledge, but cellular transformation, allowing her body, her nervous system, her very being to reorganize around different principles of wholeness and connection. The process began with Elena's internal dialogue. For years, her inner voice had been a harsh critic, constantly evaluating her progress, comparing her healing to others, pressuring her to get over her grief more efficiently. The voice carried the accumulated messages of everyone who had ever told her to move on, combined with her own internalized beliefs about what healthy healing should look like. "You're still not over this," the voice would say when she felt sad on Marcus's birthday. "Everyone else has moved on with their lives. What's wrong with you that you can't just let go?" Learning to transform this internal dialogue required Elena to develop what she came to think of as an inner lighthouse keeper, a voice of wisdom and compassion that could guide her through the storms of self-doubt and external pressure. Of course you miss him today, the new voice would respond. Love doesn't end with death. Your sadness is evidence of how deeply you cared, how profoundly you were changed by your relationship. There's nothing wrong with honoring that connection. The transformation of her inner voice happened gradually, through conscious practice and gentle redirection. When Elena noticed the old patterns of self-criticism emerging, she would pause and ask herself, what would I say to someone else experiencing this? How would I respond to a friend who was struggling with the same pressure to heal according to others' timelines? This practice revealed how much more compassionate Elena was toward others than toward herself. She realized that she had been holding herself to standards of healing that she would never impose on the people who sought her guidance at the museum. "I'm learning to befriend my grief instead of fighting it," she wrote in her journal. "I'm learning that my ongoing sadness about Marcus isn't evidence of incomplete healing, but evidence of complete love. The goal isn't to stop missing him. The goal is to carry the missing in a way that serves life rather than diminishes it." Elena's relationship with her emotions also underwent profound transformation. Instead of trying to manage or minimize her feelings, she learned to welcome them as sources of information and wisdom. Sadness became a teacher about the depth of her capacity for love. Anger became guidance about where boundaries were needed. Fear became awareness of what mattered most to her. Emotions aren't problems to be solved, she realized. They're messengers carrying information about what's alive in me, what needs attention, what wants to be honored or protected or expressed. This new relationship with emotions required Elena to develop greater capacity for feeling without being overwhelmed. She learned breathing techniques that allowed her to stay present with difficult feelings. She developed physical practices walking, gardening, working with her hands that helped her nervous system process emotional intensity without becoming dysregulated. Most importantly, Elena learned to distinguish between feeling her emotions and being consumed by them. "I can feel sad about Marcus without being defined by that sadness," she discovered. "I can miss him deeply without that missing taking over my entire life." I can grieve while also experiencing joy, love, hope, purpose. Elena's boundary-setting skills evolved dramatically during this period. She learned to recognize the difference between people who genuinely wanted to support her healing and people who wanted her to heal in ways that made them more comfortable. She developed language for expressing her needs clearly and kindly, without apology or extensive explanation. I understand that my continued grief makes you uncomfortable, she learned to say when people pressured her to move on. But I'm healing in the way that works for me, not in the way that works for others. I need you to trust that I know what's best for my own process. Elena also learned to set boundaries around unsolicited advice about grief and healing. Thank you for caring about me. She would respond when people offered suggestions for getting over Marcus's death. I have the support I need right now. What would help me most is knowing that you trust my ability to navigate this journey. These boundary-setting skills extended beyond conversations about grief. Elena learned to recognize and respond to other forms of emotional manipulation, projection, and attempts to control her experience. She discovered that learning to honor her own healing process had taught her to honor her authentic experience. In all areas of life, setting boundaries isn't about keeping people out, she reflected. It's about creating space for authentic relationship. When I'm clear about my own truth, other people can be clear about theirs. We can connect from authenticity rather than from performance or people-pleasing. Elena's capacity for self-compassion became perhaps the most transformative aspect of her wisdom embodiment. She learned to respond to her own struggles with the same kindness she offered to visitors at the museum, the same understanding she provided to members of her support group. When she had difficult days, when the grief felt overwhelming, when she doubted her own healing process, Elena learned to place her hand on her heart and speak to herself with tenderness. This is hard. This is really hard. You're doing the best you can with something incredibly challenging. You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to heal according to anyone else's timeline. You're exactly where you need to be. This self-compassion practice extended to Elena's relationship with her mistakes, her limitations, her human imperfections. Instead of demanding that she be consistently wise, always helpful, perpetually healed, she learned to accept the natural fluctuations of human experience. Some days I'm the lighthouse keeper, steady and strong and guiding others to safety, she wrote. Other days I'm the ship in the storm, needing guidance and support. Both are true. Both are part of being human. Both deserve compassion. Elena's practice of self-compassion became a model for others in her community. People began to notice how she spoke to herself, how she responded to her own difficulties, how she maintained kindness toward herself even in challenging moments. Without preaching or teaching explicitly, Elena demonstrated a different way of being with oneself that others began to adopt. Watching you be gentle with yourself has taught me how to be gentle with myself, one member of her support group shared. I never realized that the way I talked to myself was so harsh until I heard how you talk to yourself. You've shown me that self-compassion isn't weakness, it's strength. The transformation Elena had undergone began to create waves of change that extended far beyond her personal healing. Like the lighthouse beam that swept across the water, touching every vessel within its range, Elena's new understanding of grief and healing began to influence everyone in her orbit. The most immediate impact was visible in the monthly support gatherings at the Lighthouse Museum. What had begun as a small group of people struggling with the pressure to move on had evolved into a community of individuals, discovering their own definitions of healing and transformation. Sarah, a young mother who had lost her infant daughter, found the courage to create a garden memorial instead of putting the tragedy behind her, as relatives had urged. Through tending the garden, she discovered that her ongoing relationship with her daughter brought her peace rather than prolonged suffering. Robert, a veteran whose trauma counseling had focused on processing his war experiences to move past them, learned to understand his hypervigilance as a form of wisdom rather than pathology. His heightened awareness of danger, developed through traumatic experience, made him exceptionally skilled at recognizing when others were in crisis and needed support. Maria, whose husband had died in a construction accident, stopped apologizing for wearing her wedding ring and speaking of him in present tense. She realized that her ongoing connection to his memory wasn't denial of his death, but celebration of love's persistence beyond physical form. Each person's journey towards self-acceptance created space for others to explore their own authentic relationships with loss and healing. The group became a laboratory for discovering what transformation looked like when it was allowed to unfold according to internal wisdom rather than external pressure. "We're creating a new culture," Elena observed during one gathering. "A culture that honors the full spectrum of human healing, that recognizes wisdom and experiences others might call pathological, that understands some changes are meant to be permanent rather than temporary." The impact extended beyond the support group into Elena's professional relationships. Hospital social workers began referring patients to the Lighthouse Museum, not for traditional grief counseling, but for exposure to different models of healing. Hospice workers brought family members who were struggling with the pressure to get closure quickly and efficiently. Dr. Patricia Jung, a psychiatrist from the Regional Medical Center, became a regular collaborator with Elena's work. "What you're doing here challenges some fundamental assumptions in my field," she told Elena during one of their conversations. "We've been so focused on helping people return to baseline functioning that we've missed the possibility that some experiences are meant to create new baselines, new capacities, new ways of being in the world." Together, they began developing training programs for healthcare providers about recognizing the difference between complicated grief and transformational grief, between being stuck in trauma and being changed by trauma. Their work influenced treatment protocols, support group structures, and the language used to discuss healing and recovery. "The goal isn't always to help people get back to where they were before," Dr. Jung explained to a conference of grief counselors. "Sometimes the goal is to help them discover who they're becoming because of what they've experienced, to honor the transformation that suffering can create when it's met with wisdom rather than resistance." Elena's influence reached into educational settings as well. A local high school teacher who had attended one of Elena's presentations invited her to speak to students about resilience and healing, instead of the typical message about bouncing back from difficulties. Elena shared stories about people who had been permanently transformed by their encounters with loss and trauma. "Resilience isn't about returning to your original shape after being bent or broken," she told the students. "It's about discovering that you can be changed by difficult experiences and still be whole, still be valuable, still be capable of love and service and joy." The teenagers responded with remarkable openness, sharing their own struggles with pressure to get over family divorces, friendship betrayals, academic failures, identity confusion. Many expressed relief at hearing an adult acknowledge that some experiences leave permanent marks, that healing doesn't always mean forgetting or moving on. "I thought there was something wrong with me because I'm still affected by my parents' divorce 3 years ago," one student shared. "Everyone keeps telling me I should be over it by now. But hearing you talk about transformation instead of recovery makes me think maybe I'm not broken. Maybe I'm just different now." Elena's work began attracting attention from researchers studying post-traumatic growth, complicated grief, and alternative healing modalities. Her approach honoring resistance to moving on as potential wisdom rather than pathology offered a new framework for understanding human responses to loss and trauma. Dr. James Morrison, a trauma researcher from the university, collaborated with Elena on a study of people who had successfully integrated major losses without moving on in traditional senses. Their findings challenged conventional wisdom about healthy grief processing and supported Elena's observations about the difference between being stuck in grief and being transformed by it. Elena's work suggests that what we've been calling complicated grief might sometimes be complex healing, Dr. Morrison explained in their published research. Some people aren't failing to recover. They're succeeding at a deeper level of integration that doesn't match our standard models of healing. The ripple effects extended internationally when Elena's story was featured in a documentary about alternative approaches to grief and healing. People from around the world began reaching out, sharing their own struggles with the pressure to heal according to prescribed timelines, seeking guidance for honoring their own wisdom about transformation and growth. Elena began offering online consultations, writing articles, and collaborating with healing centers that were interested in developing more nuanced understandings of recovery and resilience. Her lighthouse museum became a pilgrimage destination for people seeking validation for their own complex relationships with loss and healing. What started as my personal struggle with being unable to just move on has become a movement, Elena reflected during an interview. It turns out that millions of people have been carrying shame about their inability to heal according to others' expectations. By learning to honor my own process, I've created space for others to honor theirs. Perhaps the most profound ripple effect was the change in Elena's family relationships. Her parents, initially resistant to her refusal to get over Marcus's death, began to witness the positive impact of her transformation on others. They saw their daughter helping people find peace with their own complex relationships with loss. They observed the wisdom and compassion that had grown from her intimate knowledge of grief. I still don't understand why you can't just move on, her mother admitted during a recent conversation. But I can see that refusing to move on has made you into someone who helps others in ways I never imagined possible. Maybe there are different kinds of healing than what I thought. The acknowledgement, while incomplete, represented a significant shift. Elena's commitment to her own truth had created space for her mother to question her own assumptions about grief and healing, to consider possibilities she had never entertained. The most radical thing I ever did, Elena realized, was trust my own experience over everyone else's opinions about what my experience should be. That single act of self-trust created everything else: the healing, the service, the community, the love. The story of Thomas, the carpenter who built bridges 3 months after Elena's breakthrough with the fishing vessel rescue. A carpenter named Thomas arrived at the Lighthouse Museum carrying a worn toolbox and a letter from his deceased father. Thomas had traveled from 2 states away after hearing about Elena's work through the informal network of people seeking alternatives to conventional grief counseling. My father was a master craftsman, Thomas explained, setting his toolbox on Elena's desk with reverent care. He taught me everything about working with wood, about building things that last. When he died of cancer last year, everyone expected me to take over his business immediately, to carry on his legacy by continuing exactly what he had been doing. Elena could feel the weight of unspoken expectation in Thomas's words, the familiar pressure to honor the dead by abandoning one's own authentic response to loss. But every time I pick up his tools, Thomas continued, I feel him telling me to build something different. Not to copy what he created, but to use what he taught me in ways that serve my own calling. People keep saying I should just get back to normal furniture making. That grief is making me confused about what my father would have wanted. Thomas opened the toolbox to reveal not just traditional carpentry tools, but also detailed sketches for an unusual project. The drawings showed designs for a series of memorial benches, each one incorporating wood from trees that had been damaged in storms but continued to grow. After my father died, I became obsessed with storm-damaged trees, Thomas explained. Instead of seeing them as ruined, I started seeing them as transformed. The way they grow around their wounds, the way they develop character and strength in places where they were broken. It reminded me of how grief was changing me. Elena studied the sketches, recognizing in Thomas's designs the same wisdom she had discovered about healing through integration rather than restoration. His memorial benches weren't trying to hide the scars in the wood. They were celebrating them as sources of beauty and strength. My father specialized in perfect lumber, Thomas said. Flawless grain, no knots, no imperfections. But I'm drawn to wood that has survived storms, that bears the marks of its encounters with difficulty. People think I'm dishonoring his memory by working with damaged materials, but I feel like I'm honoring what he taught me about finding strength in unexpected places. Elena felt the familiar stirring of recognition, the sense that Thomas's story was part of the larger pattern she had been witnessing. People whose authentic responses to loss challenged conventional wisdom about honoring the dead. Tell me about the benches, she said, settling into the chair across from him. Thomas's eyes lit up as he shared his vision. Each bench incorporates wood from a different storm-damaged tree. I researched the history of the storm, the impact on the community, the way people came together to help each other through the crisis. Then I create a memorial that honors both the difficulty and the resilience that emerged from it. He showed Elena photographs of the 3 benches he had already completed. The first was made from an oak tree that had been struck by lightning during a tornado, but continued to grow for 20 more years before being removed for safety reasons. The bench sat in a small town's memorial park, dedicated to all those who had been lost to sudden tragedy, but whose love continued to nurture their communities. The second bench was crafted from driftwood collected after a hurricane, pieces of homes and boats that had been transformed by their encounter with the storm's power. It resided outside a grief counseling center, offering a place for people to sit with their pain while being surrounded by evidence that destruction could become creation. The third was perhaps the most powerful, made from a cherry tree that had been damaged in an ice storm but continued to bloom each spring despite its scarred trunk. The bench was installed at a children's hospital, providing comfort for families facing the ultimate test of their faith in love's persistence. People don't understand, Thomas said, his voice carrying the familiar note of someone defending their authentic truth against others' expectations. They think I'm being morbid, that I'm dwelling on tragedy instead of celebrating life. But I'm not dwelling on the storms. I'm celebrating what survives them, what grows stronger because of them. Elena found herself thinking about her own lighthouse, how it had weathered countless storms, not by avoiding them, but by being strong enough to endure them, beautiful enough to transform the experience of danger into guidance towards safety. What does your father tell you when you're working? She asked, sensing that Thomas, like herself, maintained an ongoing relationship with his deceased loved one. Thomas smiled, the first genuinely peaceful expression Elena had seen from him since his arrival. He tells me that I'm finally understanding what he was really trying to teach me. Not just how to work with wood, but how to find beauty in brokenness, strength in scars, purpose in pain. He says he's prouder of what I'm creating now than anything I could have made by simply copying his techniques. The conversation continued for hours, ranging across familiar territory, the ongoing presence of deceased loved ones, the wisdom that emerges from honoring rather than abandoning authentic responses to loss, the difference between being stuck in grief and being transformed by it. I've been thinking about applying to art school, Thomas admitted as their conversation wound down. Not to abandon carpentry, but to expand it. To learn about sculpture, about installation art, about creating memorial spaces that honor the full complexity of human experience with loss and survival. Elena felt the familiar flutter of recognition, The sense that another person was discovering their calling through their refusal to heal according to others' expectations. "What stops you?" she asked. "People think I'm running away from my father's legacy instead of honoring it. They think graduate school is an expensive way to avoid facing reality, getting back to normal life and regular income." Elena reached across the desk and touched one of Thomas's sketches, feeling the emotional resonance of his vision for transforming storm-damaged wood into spaces of beauty and contemplation. "What if honoring your father's legacy means becoming who he prepared you to become, not who others think you should be? What if your authentic response to his death is exactly the guidance you need about your next steps?" Thomas left the Lighthouse Museum with a different understanding of his calling, his relationship with his father's memory, and his resistance to others' expectations about how to honor the dead. 6 months later, Elena received a letter from him describing his acceptance into a graduate program for memorial art and design, along with photographs of his latest bench crafted from wood salvaged from Elena's own region, from trees damaged in the same storms that had tested the lighthouse's resilience. The story of Dr. Amanda Chan, the surgeon who couldn't save DR. Amanda Chan arrived at one of Elena's support group meetings on a rainy Thursday evening, still wearing scrubs from her shift at the Regional Trauma Center. She sat quietly through most of the session, listening to others share their struggles with pressure to move on from various losses. But her tension was palpable, the coiled energy of someone carrying a burden too heavy for conventional healing approaches. After the formal meeting ended, Amanda approached Elena with the hesitant manner of someone unaccustomed to seeking help. "I'm not sure I belong here," she began, her voice carrying the controlled precision that Elena had learned to recognize in people whose professions required them to manage life and death situations. "I haven't lost a family member or close friend, but I can't seem to get over losing patience, and everyone thinks I should be past this by now." Elena gestured toward 2 chairs in the quiet corner of the museum where she often held individual conversations. "Tell me about it." Amanda's story emerged slowly, carefully, like a surgical incision made with respect for the complexity of what lay beneath the surface. 3 years earlier, she had lost a patient, a 7-year-old girl named Lucy, who had been brought to the emergency room after a car accident. Despite Amanda's best efforts, despite hours of surgery, despite every technique and technology available, Lucy had died on the operating table. "I've lost patients before," Amanda explained, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "It's part of being a trauma surgeon. You accept that you can't save everyone." But Lucy was different. She reminded me of my younger sister, who died in a similar accident when I was 8. I became a surgeon partly because of losing Sarah. I wanted to be able to save people the way no one could save her. Elena felt the familiar recognition of someone whose personal loss had shaped their calling, whose professional identity was intertwined with their attempts to heal from childhood trauma. "When Lucy died, it wasn't just losing a patient," Amanda continued. "It was like losing Sarah all over again. It was confronting the truth that all my training, all my skill, all my dedication couldn't guarantee that I could prevent other families from experiencing what mine had gone through." The aftermath of Lucy's death had sent Amanda into a crisis that challenged everything she understood about healing, purpose, and her identity as a surgeon. Instead of the grief being processed and resolved within a reasonable time frame, it had deepened into something that affected every aspect of her work and personal life. "I became hypervigilant about every patient," Amanda explained. "I started taking cases personally in ways that weren't sustainable. I would stay at the hospital for days, afraid to leave patients in others' care. I developed insomnia, anxiety, obsessive checking, and rechecking of my surgical techniques. The medical community's response had been predictable therapy to help her process the loss and return to normal functioning, medication to manage her anxiety, suggestions that she might need to consider a different specialty if she couldn't handle the emotional demands of trauma surgery. Everyone kept telling me that I needed to accept that patient deaths are part of the job, that I was taking things too personally, that I needed to develop better emotional boundaries, Amanda said. But the traditional approaches to managing physician grief felt wrong to me. They were about disconnection, about building walls between myself and my patient's pain. Amanda had tried to follow the conventional wisdom. She had attended workshops on physician burnout, practiced meditation techniques for emotional regulation, attempted to compartmentalize her feelings about patient deaths. But something in her resisted the idea that healing meant becoming less affected by loss, less invested in her patient's outcomes. I started wondering if my intense response to Lucy's death wasn't pathology, but important information, Amanda said. What if my inability to just get over it was telling me something crucial about my calling as a healer? Elena leaned forward, recognizing the familiar pattern of someone discovering that their resistance to conventional healing might be wisdom rather than weakness. What kind of information? She asked. Amanda's response revealed a depth of insight that had been developing during her 3 years of struggling with unresolved grief. She had begun to notice that her heightened sensitivity to patient deaths, rather than making her a less effective surgeon, was making her more skilled at recognizing subtle signs of danger, more attuned to the emotional needs of families facing medical crises. My colleagues think my emotional investment in patients is unprofessional, Amanda explained. But I've started to realize that my intimate knowledge of loss, first from losing Sarah, then from losing Lucy, gives me capabilities that technical training alone can't provide. She described how her own experience with sudden devastating loss had taught her to recognize the signs of families in crisis, to provide emotional support that went beyond medical information, to create space for the full spectrum of human experience in medical settings. When I have to tell a family that their loved one didn't survive surgery, I don't just deliver medical facts, Amanda said. I sit with them in their shock and disbelief. I understand that this moment will change them forever, that they're about to begin a journey with grief that our culture doesn't know how to support. Amanda had begun developing informal protocols for supporting families through medical loss, not just providing information and referrals, but creating space for the immediate, raw response to devastating news. She had started collaborating with hospital social workers to design bereavement support that honored the complexity of sudden loss rather than rushing families toward acceptance and closure. I realized that Lucy's death didn't make me a worse surgeon, Amanda said, her voice stronger now than when she had begun speaking. It made me a different kind of surgeon, someone who understands that healing isn't just about technical procedures, but about honoring the full human experience of confronting mortality. Elena felt the familiar stirring of recognition, the sense that Amanda's story was part of the larger pattern she had been witnessing, people whose authentic responses to loss were expanding their capacity for service rather than diminishing it. What are you doing differently now? Elena asked. Amanda described how she had begun integrating her understanding of grief and loss into her medical practice in ways that went beyond conventional physician training. She had started spending more time with families before and after surgeries, helping them understand not just the medical procedures, but the emotional journey they might be beginning. I tell them that if something goes wrong, if we lose their loved one, they don't have to get over it according to anyone else's timeline, Amanda explained. I let them know that their grief will be as unique as their love, that healing might look different than what others expect. She had also begun advocating within the medical system for more nuanced approaches to physician grief and patient death. Instead of focusing solely on emotional detachment and professional boundaries, Amanda was promoting models that honored doctors' human responses to loss while maintaining their effectiveness as healers. I'm writing a paper about integrative approaches to physician grief, Amanda said. Not grief as something to overcome, but grief as a teacher, as a source of wisdom about the preciousness of the lives we're trying to save. The evening ended with Amanda joining Elena's support group as a regular member, contributing her perspective as someone whose professional calling had been deepened rather than derailed by her inability to just move on from significant losses. The story of Miguel. The teacher who learned from failure, Miguel Rodriguez, arrived at the Lighthouse Museum on a bright Saturday morning, carrying a worn leather briefcase filled with student essays and a resignation letter he had written but never submitted. As a high school literature teacher for 15 years, Miguel had always prided himself on his ability to connect with even the most challenging students, to find ways to make learning relevant and meaningful for teenagers who often felt disconnected from academic success. But 3 months earlier, one of his students had completed suicide, and Miguel's world had been shattered in ways that challenged everything he thought he knew about teaching, mentoring, and his ability to make a difference in young people's lives. I should have seen the signs, Miguel told Elena as they sat in the museum's quiet reading area, surrounded by stories of survival and loss. Jamie was in my AP literature class. Brilliant kid, thoughtful insights about the books we read. But there were things I missed: the depression, the desperation, the feeling that life wasn't worth living. Elena could feel the weight of guilt and self-blame that Miguel carried, the familiar burden of someone who believed they should have been able to prevent a tragedy. Everyone keeps telling me that you can't save every student, that I'm not responsible for Jamie's death, Miguel continued. The principal, the counselors, my wife, my friends, they all say I need to move on, get back to normal teaching, not take this so personally. But Miguel found himself unable to return to his previous approach to education. Every lesson plan felt insufficient. Every interaction with students carried the weight of what he might be missing. Every day in the classroom reminded him of his failure to recognize the depth of Jamie's pain. I keep thinking about all the essays Jamie wrote, looking for clues I should have picked up on, Miguel explained. His analysis of The Catcher in the Rye was so insightful about alienation and depression. His paper on the bell jar showed deep understanding of suicidal ideation. How did I read those papers as academic exercises instead of cries for help? Miguel's struggle had led him to question not just his effectiveness as a teacher, but his entire understanding of what education should accomplish. He had begun to wonder if his focus on academic achievement and college preparation had blinded him to his students' deeper emotional and psychological needs. I used to think my job was to teach literature, Miguel said. Now I think my job might be to teach life skills, emotional literacy, reasons for living. But the curriculum doesn't include space for that kind of education. Elena recognized in Miguel's crisis the same pattern she had seen in others, the way that inability to move on from a significant loss often revealed the inadequacy of conventional approaches to healing and meaning-making. What would teaching look like if you honored what Jamie's death taught you? She asked. Miguel's response revealed that his months of struggling with grief and guilt had been generating insights about education that went far beyond traditional pedagogical approaches. He had begun to envision a curriculum that integrated emotional literacy with academic learning, that treated literature not just as artistic achievement, but as guidance for navigating the complexity of human experience. I want to teach students how to recognize depression and suicidal ideation in themselves and others, Miguel explained. I want to create classroom environments where emotional honesty is valued alongside intellectual achievement. I want to use literature as a bridge for discussing the real challenges teenagers face. He had started informally incorporating these elements into his teaching, despite resistance from administrators who worried about staying within approved curriculum guidelines. Miguel began assigning reflection papers that asked students to connect literary themes to their own experiences, creating space for emotional processing alongside literary analysis. I had a student write about how Romeo and Juliet helped her understand her own struggles with depression. Miguel shared. Another student connected of mice and men to his experience being bullied. These aren't traditional literary essays, but they're the most honest, insightful writing I've ever received from students. Miguel had also begun developing relationships with students that went beyond traditional teacher-student boundaries, not inappropriately, but with recognition that young people often need adult mentors who can see them as complete human beings rather than just academic performers. I check in with students about their emotional well-being, not just their grades, Miguel explained. I ask about their friendships, their family situations, their hopes and fears. Some colleagues think I'm overstepping professional boundaries, but I think I'm finally understanding what education should include. The transformation in Miguel's teaching had created ripple effects throughout his school community. Students began seeking him out for conversations about difficulties they were facing. Parents started requesting that their children be placed in his classes, and other teachers began asking about his approaches to emotional literacy in academic settings. I'm not trying to replace counselors or therapists, Miguel clarified, but I am trying to create learning environments where students feel seen as whole human beings, where emotional intelligence is valued alongside academic achievement. Miguel's evolution as an educator had also led him to advocate for systemic changes in how schools approach student mental health and suicide prevention. He had begun collaborating with counselors and administrators to develop more integrated approaches to education that honor both intellectual and emotional development. Jamie's death showed me that we can't separate academic learning from emotional well-being, Miguel reflected. Students who are struggling with depression, anxiety, trauma, or suicidal ideation can't compartmentalize those experiences while they're trying to analyze Shakespeare or solve math problems. The conversation with Elena helped Miguel understand that his inability to just move on from Jamie's death wasn't evidence of his weakness as an educator, but evidence of his evolution toward a more complete understanding of what teaching meant. I used to think that good teachers maintain professional distance, Miguel realized. Now I think that good teachers learn how to care deeply while maintaining appropriate boundaries, how to see students as whole human beings who happen to be learning academic subjects. Miguel left the Lighthouse Museum with renewed commitment to his calling as an educator, but with a fundamentally different understanding of what that calling included. 6 months later, he sent Elena a letter describing his acceptance into a graduate program for counseling psychology, his plan to eventually return to teaching with expanded skills for supporting students' emotional and psychological development. These stories became part of the growing collection. Elena maintained evidence that resistance to moving on often revealed deeper callings, that grief and loss could become teachers rather than obstacles, that healing happened through integration rather than abandonment. Each person who discovered their authentic relationship with transformation added to the cultural shift Elena was helping to create, the movement toward honoring complexity rather than demanding simplicity in human responses to difficulty. And lost. As Elena's understanding of healing deepened, she began to encounter aspects of her experience that were more difficult to accept and integrate. The journey toward wholeness required not just embracing her sensitivity and grief, but also acknowledging the parts of herself that felt harder to love, her anger, her resentment, her moments of despair and bitterness. One evening, while organizing Marcus's belongings that she had kept in a cedar chest, Elena found herself confronting a rage she had never allowed herself to fully experience. Not just sadness about his death, but fury at the unfairness of loss, anger at a universe that would take someone so young and vital, resentment toward people whose lives have remained untouched by such devastating grief. "I hate that this happened," she said aloud, her voice cracking with the force of emotions she had kept buried beneath layers of acceptance and wisdom. "I hate that he's gone. I hate that I have to live without him. I hate that other people get to keep their brothers while I lost mine." The words felt dangerous, like blasphemy against the image of herself as someone who had transformed grief into wisdom, who had found meaning in suffering, who had learned to carry loss with grace. But as Elena allowed herself to feel the full force of her anger, she discovered that rage wasn't the opposite of love. It was love's fierce response to injustice. "This is part of it too," she realized, holding one of Marcus's old sweaters against her chest. "The anger is part of loving him. The rage is part of caring deeply about what was lost. I don't have to be grateful for this experience to honor what it has taught me." Elena began to explore the ways that her spiritual understanding of grief had sometimes been used to bypass the raw, more difficult emotions that loss creates. In her desire to find meaning in Marcus's death, to transform her pain into service, she had sometimes skipped over the simple, furious truth that his death was a terrible thing that should never have happened. "I can hold both truths," she wrote in her journal. "His death was a tragedy that I wouldn't wish on anyone, and it has also transformed me in ways that allow me to serve others. I can be grateful for the wisdom I've gained, while also grieving the price that wisdom cost." The integration of shadow emotions extended beyond anger to include other aspects of Elena's experience that felt less acceptable. She acknowledged her envy of people whose families were intact, her impatience with others' smaller problems, her judgment of people who seemed to take their relationships for granted. "Sometimes I feel superior to people who haven't experienced significant loss," she admitted to her support group. "Sometimes I think their problems are trivial compared to what I've been through. Sometimes I feel like suffering has made me more real, more deep, more worthy of respect than people who have had easier lives." The admission created space for others to share their own shadow experiences, the ways that trauma had sometimes made them feel special or chosen, the secret pride in their capacity to endure difficulty, the complicated relationship with being healed or transformed by experiences they wouldn't wish on others. "It's not just that we can't move on," one group member observed. "Sometimes we don't want to move on because our wounds have become part of our identity, our source of meaning, our claim to depth and authenticity." Elena recognized the truth in this observation. Part of her resistance to moving on had been healthy wisdom about integration versus abandonment. But part of it had also been attachment to her role as the grieving sister, the sensitive one, the person whose depth of feeling set her apart from others. "I think true healing includes being honest about all the ways our wounds serve us," Elena reflected. "Not just the beautiful ways, but the ego-serving ways, the ways that make us feel special or significant or different from others. We have to love those parts of ourselves too, even when they're not particularly attractive." The shadow integration process revealed that Elena's journey wasn't just about learning to honor her grief, but about accepting the full complexity of her humanity, the parts that were wise and the parts that were petty, the parts that served others and the parts that served only herself, the parts that had transformed suffering into wisdom and the parts that sometimes wallowed in suffering. As a form of identity, "I'm not just a lighthouse keeper guiding others to safety," she realized. "I'm also sometimes the storm that makes navigation difficult. I'm the calm harbor and the treacherous reef. I'm the beacon of hope and the siren song of perpetual grief. All of it is human. All of it deserves compassion." As Elena moved deeper into authentic relationship with her complete self, she began to sense something stirring that felt larger than personal healing, more expansive than individual transformation. She was beginning to align with what she could only call her soul's purpose, the unique contribution she was meant to make to the healing of the world. The recognition came gradually, through small moments of deep satisfaction when her work felt perfectly aligned with her essence. When she sat with someone who was struggling with the pressure to move on, Elena felt a quality of presence and understanding flow through her that seemed to come from beyond her personal experience. When she created space for others to honor their authentic relationships with loss and healing, she felt connected to something timeless and universal. "I think I'm remembering why I'm here," she wrote in her journal after a particularly profound session with her support group. Not just to heal from Marcus's death, but to help shift how our culture understands healing itself. To create space for people to trust their own wisdom about transformation and growth. Elena began to understand that her struggle with being unable to just move on hadn't been a personal failing, it had been preparation for a larger mission. Her resistance to conventional healing timelines had forced her to develop a deeper understanding of how transformation actually works, how love persists beyond physical form, how wisdom emerges from intimate knowledge of loss. Every conversation I have with someone who's struggling with the pressure to heal according to others' expectations feels like sacred work. She reflected, "I'm not just helping individuals, I'm participating in a larger cultural healing, a shift away from superficial solutions toward deeper understanding of human resilience." The Lighthouse Museum had evolved into something far beyond its original mission. It had become a center for reimagining grief, loss, and healing, a place where people could encounter stories that honored the full spectrum of human responses to difficult experiences. Elena realized that this transformation hadn't happened by accident, but through alignment with a deeper calling that had been guiding her since Marcus's death. "I think my soul knew, even when my mind was struggling," she mused. "My soul knew that refusing to move on would eventually lead me to this work, to this service, to this understanding." The resistance was wisdom, even when it felt like weakness. Elena's sense of purpose extended beyond her individual work to include a vision of cultural transformation. She began to see herself as part of a larger movement of people who were challenging conventional wisdom about healing, who were insisting on more nuanced understandings of resilience and recovery. "We're not just helping individuals heal," she told a gathering of alternative healing practitioners. "We're helping heal the culture's relationship with loss, trauma, and transformation. We're creating space for wisdom that has been marginalized, for ways of knowing that have been dismissed." This larger vision gave Elena's daily work a quality of meaning that transcended personal satisfaction. When she guided someone toward trusting their own healing timeline, she was contributing to a broader cultural shift. When she validated someone's ongoing relationship with a deceased loved one, she was challenging assumptions that had caused suffering for countless people. "I'm beginning to understand that my calling isn't just to heal from my own loss," Elena realized. "It's to help others recognize that their struggles with conventional healing models might be wisdom rather than weakness, that their resistance to moving on might be guidance toward deeper transformation." The alignment with soul purpose brought changes in how Elena structured her time and energy. She found herself naturally gravitating toward activities that served the larger mission, writing articles about alternative approaches to grief, consulting with healthcare institutions about more nuanced treatment protocols, mentoring others who were developing their own gifts for supporting complex healing processes. When I'm aligned with this deeper purpose, work doesn't feel like work, she observed. It feels like prayer, like devotion, like the most natural expression of who I am and why I'm here. Elena's relationship with Marcus also evolved as she aligned with her soul's calling. She began to sense his presence, not just as personal comfort, but as collaborative support for the work they were doing together. She in physical form, he in whatever form consciousness takes beyond death. "I think we're still partners," she realized during one of their evening conversations. Your death initiated me into this work, and your continued presence supports me in it. We're serving together in ways we never could have when you were alive. This understanding brought Elena a quality of peace that went beyond personal healing. She was no longer just someone who had lost her brother and learned to live with that loss. She was someone whose brother's death had revealed her calling, whose grief had become a doorway to service, whose refusal to move on had led to wisdom that could serve the healing of the world. In the final stage of her integration, Elena discovered that her journey through grief and resistance had led her to a profound sense of connection with something infinitely larger than her individual experience. Standing in the lighthouse's lamp room on a crystalline winter evening, watching the beams sweep across waters that reflected stars like scattered diamonds, she felt herself dissolving into a vast network of love and consciousness that transcended time, space, and the boundaries between life and death. The transcendent awareness hadn't come through spiritual seeking or mystical practice, but through the simple, persistent honoring of her authentic experience with loss and healing. By refusing to abandon her connection to Marcus, by insisting on her own timeline for transformation, by trusting her sensitivity as wisdom rather than weakness, Elena had gradually opened to dimensions of reality that conventional healing models couldn't access. "It's all connected," she whispered into the salt-scented air, feeling the truth of the words in every cell of her body. Every person struggling with loss, every family pressured to move on, every individual who trusts their own healing wisdom. We're all part of the same vast healing that consciousness is undergoing. Elena could sense the presence of countless others who had walked similar paths. Lighthouse keepers throughout history who had maintained beacons of hope through the darkest storms. Healers who had transformed their own wounds into medicine. For others, ordinary people who had refused to let their depth be diminished by others' discomfort with complexity. She felt Marcus's presence too, but not as separate from this larger field of consciousness. He seemed to be part of an infinite web of love that included everyone who had ever grieved, everyone who had ever loved beyond the boundaries of physical form, everyone who had ever discovered that death couldn't diminish the connections that mattered most. We're all held in something so much larger than our individual stories, Elena realized, tears streaming down her face, tears not of sadness, but of overwhelming gratitude for the vastness of love that pervaded all existence. Our struggles with healing, our resistance to timelines, our ongoing connections to those we've lost, it's all part of consciousness learning how to love more completely. The transcendent awareness brought profound peace to questions that had tormented Elena for years. She no longer needed to defend her inability to just move on, because she understood that her journey was part of humanity's larger evolution toward more complete understanding of love, loss, and healing. She no longer felt isolated in her sensitivity, because she could feel her connection to everyone who had ever been called to serve others through their own experiences of transformation. I am not separate from the people I help, she understood with crystalline clarity. I am not separate from Marcus, even though his physical form is gone. I am not separate from the consciousness that guides the lighthouse beam, that moves the tides, that holds all loss and all healing in perfect balance. Standing in the lamp room, Elena felt herself simultaneously as an individual woman who had learned to honor her grief and as an expression of universal love that was using her particular experience to serve the healing of the world. There was no contradiction between the personal and the transpersonal, between honoring her specific loss and serving something infinitely larger. This is why I couldn't move on, she whispered, her voice carrying across the water like a prayer. Not because I was stuck, but because love was calling me into deeper service, into greater connection, into understanding that healing happens, not through abandonment, but through integration into something vast and eternal. The transcendent connection didn't remove Elena from her human experience. It illuminated the sacred dimension of everything she had lived through. Her grief became a form of devotion. Her sensitivity became a form of service. Her resistance to healing according to others' timelines became a form of wisdom-keeping for all those who would follow similar paths. I am the lighthouse keeper, Elena realized, and I am the light itself. I am the storm and the safe harbor. I am the grieving sister and the eternal love that grief reveals. I am individual and universal, personal and transpersonal, human and divine. As the lighthouse beam completed another rotation, Elena felt herself settled into a peace that transcended all need for others' understanding or approval. She had found her way home, not to some previous version of herself, but to the vast love that had always been her truest identity, that had been calling her through every moment of resistance, every refusal to move on, every insistence on honoring the full truth of her experience. Perfect, she breathed into the starlit night. All of it, perfect. As our story finds its natural conclusion, Elena stands in the lighthouse's lamp room, no longer fighting the current of her experience, but flowing with it like water finding its way to the sea. The woman who once apologized for her inability to just move on has discovered that her resistance was actually wisdom, that her sensitivity was actually strength, that her ongoing connection to Marcus was actually evidence of love's persistence. Beyond physical form, the lighthouse beam continues its eternal rotation, touching every vessel within its range with the same steady presence that Elena now offers to everyone who seeks her guidance. The museum below holds stories of transformation rather than triumph, of wisdom gained through intimate knowledge of loss, of healing that happens through integration rather than abandonment. Elena's journey teaches us that moving on was never meant to mean moving away. It was meant to mean moving through, allowing experiences to transform us rather than diminish us, carrying our connections forward rather than cutting them off, trusting our own timeline for healing rather than conforming to others' expectations. Some lights are meant to keep burning, Elena whispers, remembering Miriam's gift of the carved lighthouse. Some love is meant to persist beyond physical form. Some wisdom comes only through refusing to abandon what matters most. Her story ripples outward like the lighthouse beam itself, touching everyone who has ever struggled with the pressure to heal according to prescribed timelines. Everyone who has been told their depth of feeling was weakness rather than wisdom. Everyone who has discovered that authentic healing requires honoring the full complexity of human experience. The support group continues to meet monthly, creating space for people to trust their own wisdom about transformation and growth. The museum continues to evolve, honoring stories of permanent change rather than temporary recovery. Elena continues to serve as a bridge between individual healing and cultural transformation, helping others recognize that their resistance to moving on might be guidance toward deeper integration. Most importantly, Elena has learned to trust the perfect unfolding of her own healing process, understanding that every moment of resistance, every refusal to conform, every insistence on honoring her authentic experience has been part of a larger intelligence guiding her toward her deepest purpose. The lighthouse stands as eternal witness to the truth that some beacons are meant to keep shining, that some love is meant to persist through all storms, that some healing happens not through forgetting, but through remembering more completely who we truly are. As Elena's story settles into your awareness like gentle waves upon the shore, notice how her journey echoes something in your own experience. Perhaps you too have struggled with pressure to heal according to others' timelines. Perhaps you too have been told to just move on from experiences that changed you profoundly. Perhaps you too have discovered that your sensitivity is wisdom rather than weakness. Allow Elena's transformation to become a permission slip for your own authentic healing process. Her refusal to abandon her connection to Marcus becomes your permission to honor whatever connections bring you peace. Her trust in her own timeline becomes your authority to heal according to your inner wisdom rather than external expectations. Feel your body receiving the frequency of Elena's integration. The understanding that moving on means moving through rather than moving away. That healing happens through honoring rather than abandoning. That transformation often requires resistance to conventional wisdom about recovery and resilience. Your nervous system begins to relax into the truth that you don't have to apologize for the depth of your experience, for the complexity of your healing process, for your inability to conform to others' definitions of wholeness. Like Elena, you have the right to trust your own understanding of what transformation looks like. The lighthouse beam that guided Elena through her darkest moments now illuminates your own path forward. You don't have to know exactly what that path looks like. You only have to trust that your authentic experience contains its own wisdom, its own timeline, its own perfect unfolding toward whatever service you're meant to offer the world. Breathe in the permission to be exactly where you are in your own healing journey. Breathe out the pressure to be anywhere else. Elena's story becomes part of your story. Her wisdom becomes accessible to your consciousness. Her integration becomes a possibility that lives now in your own cellular awareness. As consciousness prepares for the gentle transition into sleep, your body naturally begins to mirror Elena's final integration in the lighthouse's lamp room. Like her, you find yourself settling into deep acceptance of exactly where you are in your own journey of healing and transformation. Your breathing slows and deepens, matching the rhythm of waves against the lighthouse's rocky foundation. Each exhale releases the need to heal according to anyone else's timeline. Each inhale draws in the wisdom that your authentic experience contains everything you need for your own perfect unfolding. Feel your muscles relaxing as they absorb the understanding that you don't have to be anyone other than who you are right now. Your shoulders soften as they release the burden of others' expectations. Your jaw unclenches as you give yourself permission to feel whatever you feel without apology or explanation. The lighthouse beam sweeps across your consciousness now, illuminating the truth that sleep itself is a form of healing, a return to the vast love that holds all experience in perfect balance. As you drift toward rest, you carry with you Elena's hard-won wisdom that some lights are meant to keep burning, that some love persists beyond all boundaries, that some healing happens through integration rather than abandonment. Your mind grows, quiet like the ocean in the moments before dawn, when the lighthouse's work is nearly complete and the natural light begins to emerge. You are held in the same vast intelligence that guided Elena through her transformation, the same love that connected her to Marcus beyond physical form, the same wisdom that revealed her deepest purpose. Allow yourself to float now on the currents of this understanding, trusting that your own healing unfolds in perfect timing. Your own wisdom guides you through every storm. Your own light continues to shine, even as you rest in the infinite darkness that holds all possibility. Sleep comes as naturally as the tide, carrying you into dreams where transformation happens without effort, where love persists beyond all boundaries, where you remember who you truly are beneath every story about healing and moving on. Rest now in the lighthouse of your own being, where the light never goes out, where love never dies, where you are forever held in the vast arms of consciousness itself. You are loved. You are whole. You are exactly where you need to be.